The New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society is pleased to present this recording from May 26, 2021, Empresses of Power. Our promotions chair, Susan Wands, is in conversation with authors Faith L. Justice and James Conroyd Martin, discussing the life and historical times of two Byzantine empresses. Pulcheria, sister of Emperor Theodosius II, who profoundly influenced the early days of the Orthodox Catholic Church, and Theodora, wife of Emperor Justinian, who championed women's rights a century later. A fascinating discussion for readers and writers alike. Information about our chapter and its leadership is available at our website, link listed in the description. Thank you and enjoy the program.
I'm so thrilled to be able to talk to you today about these two books about empresses. And I'm also really thrilled to have Faith Justice, her book being featured, because she's worked tirelessly for the New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society. And we finally get a chance to feature one of her books. And the fact that we do get to pair Faith's book, Dawn Empress, with James' book, Fortune's Child, is really remarkable, because both these books explore empresses who I have never heard of before. And once I started reading their books, I felt that there should be entire history curriculum in schools and universities exploring the world of these two women. So let me just set up a little bit about who these two people are. Because one of the reasons we're looking at empresses is because more and more women are taking on world leadership roles. And these two women changed the course of history. One was an empress from the time of the Roman Empire, and the other was from the Byzantine era. One fought for the power of the church, and the other was the first to negotiate rights for women. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Faith's book first. Faith Justice's book, Dawn Empress, tells the little-known story of Princess Pulcheria. Is that how you pronounce it, Dawn?
Yes, Pulcheria.
Yes, who at 15 was pronounced Augusta. That means she was in charge of taking care of the up-and-coming underage emperor. And she acted as a guardian for her brother, the 4th century Roman Emperor Theodosius II. She created an identity for herself that became a powerful tool in war negotiations and for the future of the church. So here we have this Dawn Empress. She is in the 4th century. And now we're going to talk about James' book. And in James Conroyd Martin's book, Fortune's Child, this is set in the 6th century Constantinople. And the beginnings of this character, Theodora, were not very promising. She came from a disreputable background as an actress, maybe a prostitute, and the daughter of a circus bear keeper. And through an extraordinary ascent at 28 years of age, she married Emperor Justinian. Is that how you pronounce it, James?
Justinian, yes.
Okay, Justinian I. And she evolved into one of the most powerful women in Byzantine history. So we're going to talk about how these two women, who were the most unlikely leaders, came to lead entire empires during their time. So first of all, I'd like to ask our authors to read a selection from their books so we can hear in their own words what they thought this represents what their book is. So Faith, could I ask you to go first in reading a selection from Dawn Empress?
Sure. I'm actually going to start at the beginning because this is the part that it kicks off everything. I mean, almost everything you need to know about Pulcheria, you can divine from this, very traumatic beginning. Okay. So this takes place in the Imperial Palace, Constantinople. It's October 6th, 404. Okay. Pulcheria winced as her father's hand ground her fingers together. She stepped on the hem of her night shift and stumbled. Father jerked her upright. "Come, girl, when did you become so clumsy?" His voice was rough with wine, anger, and pain. Pulcheria had never seen him so distraught in her 5 short years of life. For the first time, her father, Arcadius, the emperor of Eastern Rome, frightened her. When he had awakened her moments before, her head muzzy with dreams, she knew something was wrong. Father never came to her chambers. The palace nursery where she and her siblings, Arcadia, Theodosius, and baby Marina lived, was the province of nurses and tutors. She only saw him on those rare occasions he ordered the children to accompany him on some outing. Her mother, Empress Eudoxia, inspected the nursery and questioned the servants about her children's health and well-being when it suited her, which was not often. Now her father dragged her down the echoing marble halls toward a part of the palace to which she had never been. They entered a sumptuous but disordered receiving room. A half-eaten meal of beef doused with fishy-smelling garum sauce sat on a silver tray. The Persian carpet lay askew, and several cloaks lay carelessly on a gilt chair. The disarray only added to her chaotic feelings of fear and bewilderment. She tried to lag behind, but her father dragged her forward, nearly pulling her off her feet. Pulcheria whimpered at the pain in her hand and shoulder, but refused to cry out. Antiochus, the chief eunuch and head of the imperial household, sat near the door to another chamber. He rose, approached her father, and bowed low. "I'm so very sorry, Augustus, but your blessed wife is dead. She passed on to God's good grace but moments ago." "More likely she passed on to the devil. She will make him a good whore." Arcadius's face went purple as he spat the words at the eunuch. "The child?" Antiochus glanced at Pulcheria and lowered his voice. "He came much too early to save." "Better dead than another set of horns on my head," her father muttered. Pulcheria struggled to find meaning in the words of the adults. Her mother was dead? What child? Her father grew horns? She looked at his forehead with muddled curiosity, but saw no bumps. Father started forward, pushing at the eunuch's chest. "Out of my way." Antiochus stepped back, but still blocked their path. His voice quavered. "Most kind Augustus, is this really the place for the princess? Let us at least ready the body before she views it." Pulcheria tugged on her captive hand and cried, "Please, father, let me go back." Father's hand tightened on hers, but he turned and dropped to one knee to look into her face. "This is important, Pulcheria. You will be first lady of the land now. Show me how an Augusta behaves." Pulcheria studied under his gaze. She wanted to make him proud. "Yes, father, I will do as you wish."
Wow.
Woo.
Wow.
Excellent. I'd like to remind everybody that during the course of the question and answer, both James and Faith will be giving away a digital e-reader of their books. So as you listen to them read and as during the interview, if whoever types the first question to each one of these authors in the chat field will get the ebook. So you may want to pay extra attention during James' selection as he reads. So James, would you like to read a selection from your book?
Okay, and I didn't do my homework here. I know what I'm going to read, but I might stop and move it forward a few paragraphs so that I can fit it all in. Okay, so a eunuch, Stephen, narrates both books. And so the first book, much of it, you get a lot of his life, fictional eunuch. And then he meets Theodora. That's where we're going to pick it up, with him actually meeting Theodora, although we've met her in the book long before this. So this is Stephen. He meets her on a ship. They're both leaving Antioch for Constantinople. He's never been there. She's returning there after having been a governor's mistress, cast-off mistress in the Pentapolis, North Africa. She's worked her way up through the Levant and finally has booked a ship for back to Constantinople. So Stephen says, "My heart thumps heavily in the early fall of 520 as I board the Sea Goddess, a merchant ship. The spaces between the beats fill with fear. I have never trusted my life to a vessel that rides the seas. Gaspar was deadly afraid of sailing, so that we had always traveled overland. The sea goddess is filled out with two masts. The one at midship holds a large square sail, while the other at the bow supports a smaller sail, also square. A stout hull contains wood, cereals, olive oil, and wine meant for Constantinople. I count more than 100 oars manned by a sun-darkened crew. It is afternoon on our first day at sea, and I am congratulating myself on my seafaring endurance. We are seated at the table, and Narcissus is questioning me about my life with my parents when the ship plows head on into what he calls a squall. Up and down and up, the ship heaves, lurching to the right, then to the left. The cabin timbers creaking. My stomach follows suit. Why, you're as white as a bleached sail, Narcissus says, as if amused. It's your first voyage, so I'm not surprised. You have yet to earn your sea legs. I'm unable to reply. My roiling insides threaten to erupt. A gagging sensation takes hold. Using the tabletop, I push myself up and stumbled a few feet to my cot. I sit at the side of it. It will do you no good to lie down, Stephen, he says, and even a swab will hold you in poor regard if he has to clean up the planking in here of your stinking spew. I look at Narcissus in horror. Go up on deck. Do you remember where the stern post is? I nod. A bitter fluid is filling my throat, rising. Narcissus is all soberness now. Go, he shouts, pointing toward the cabin door. I fly off my cot, throw back the door, and rush up the steep ladder-like steps. I turn toward the stern and climb the little ramp to the stern post, where it is situated beneath the ship's carved ornament of a swan. I am no sooner at the balustrade than the contents of my stomach, egg, gruel, and bread, spill into the sea. When I think I am finished, another spasm at my middle disgorges the last of the bitter bile. White-knuckled, I stare into the rocking ship's turbid wake, sick and mewling like a poisoned puppy, wondering how I had come to this, fearful of where this ship, where life is taking me. Skipping just a little bit. Are you all right, sailor? The voice is high, shrill, and yet musical in the loud gale. I spin around, nearly certain I am being mocked by the young swab who empties our privy bucket and sees to our food and comfort. I am in no mood and perfectly ready to strike him down, no matter the consequences. But there before me now, in a wet and dark hooded cloak, stands the most beautiful woman I have ever seen. She is laughing, her deep-set black eyes sparkling, droplets from the mist striking her face like liquid gold. Suddenly, I realize the droplets are merely reflecting her aura, which is coming through to me with no effort on my part, and it is gold, metallic gold. My legs buckle, my heart gives. I stare, blinking against the sea spray, and the thought that this is but a vision that will dissipate with the mist. Of course, she is real, and I feel a fool and must look like one too. The vision steps forward. Here, she says, taking something from her inner pocket. Chew on this. I gawk at the piece of root she holds out to me. What is it? Ginger. It should settle your stomach. What's left of it, you mean? I reach for it. You've taken some? I have. I wish I had had some on my voyage out of the city. Constantinople? She nods. Oh, I managed all right, even through some squalls worse than this, but others were not so lucky. I do think the sea is settling and we'll find our balance soon. I nod, wanting to please the lady. I begin to chew. The salty sea spray coming at us adds tanginess to the sweetness of the roots. I am searching for words, conversation. Was it a merchant ship as well? Indeed not. It was a trireme, a vessel that would make this ship look like a toy. A trireme, a warship, a massive warship with 3 levels of rowers. I'm impressed. In my travels with Gaspar along the way of the sea, we did sight on occasion such huge vessels. I would wonder what they carried. And so that's his meeting with Theodora. he's been purchased by Narses for the palace. He doesn't know that yet. He doesn't know what he's going to. He had originally been purchased from his family by a Syrian sort of shifter and magician. And when he lived out his usefulness for him, the magician Magus sold him to a crew that saw that he was made a eunuch, saw that he was cut. And so I'll shut up.
Fascinating. That's a great intro to both of these characters. I'm so curious to know, both James and Faith, when did you first hear about your empresses? How did you hear about them, and how did you research them? Faith, can we start with you? How did you hear about her?
Sure. A long, long time ago, when I was researching my first novel, Selene of Alexandria, which featured Hypatia, the famous lady philosopher, mathematician. Some people might have seen the movie Agora. Rachel Weisz played her in that. But anyway, so it was set during the same time period. And so as I was doing my research into my first novel, I ran across the fact that this 15-year-old girl had taken over the Eastern Empire during this time. And I was like, what? Yeah, this is like amazing. How on earth could a 15-year-old take over half the Roman Empire at age 15? And I made a mental note. She actually shows up in my book tangentially. She has agents that come and represent her in Alexandria. But I made a mental note that I wanted to find out more about her. So after I'd finished writing my first book, I started researching my second, and I found all these fascinating Theodosian women. And it wasn't just Pulcheria, it was her aunt Placidia, and it was Athenaeus, who was her sister-in-law. And I thought, oh my God, I got to write about these women. They're just like, one got captured by the Goths and married their king. I mean, romance. Pulcheria is this political prodigy, and Athenaeus, had this romance story. I mean, it was just like, it was incredible. So anyway, so that's how I ran across them. And I spent years researching, and I was originally going to have it all in one book and intertwine their stories because they all take place at the same time. And I decided there was just too much. So I wrote the first two books, and Athenaeus will be in the third book. So they each get their own book.
I just have to ask a quick question about why the title Dawn Empress?
Very good. Yeah, I started off writing Placidia's story, and she ruled the West as it was falling. So I thought of her as the Twilight Empresses, the twilight of the Roman Empire. And Pulcheria ruled in the East, right as it was turning into the Byzantine Empire. In fact, the Byzantines didn't call themselves Byzantines, they called themselves Romans, because it was the Eastern Roman Empire. And so when the West fell, the East stayed on for another 1,000 years. So it was the twilight of the West and the dawn of the East.
Oh, that's fantastic. And James, I'm dying to know, how did you hear about Theodora?
Well, that'll show my age. I was living in Los Angeles. This is many years ago, and working on I discovered the material for Push Not the River, and I was working on that, and I had an agent working on that. And at a certain point, she said, well, just start something else. And I was taking a course, an art appreciation course at a junior college. And we studied the Ravenna mosaics of Justinian and Theodora. And the professor says, I'm not a writer, but if I were a writer, this is the woman I would be writing about. And so, ding-a-ling, it was like, okay, well, here's my other thing that I'm supposed to be working on. And so that's where it started, and it was a lot of years ago. I went down to the Hollywood Public Library, walked down brought back a massive number of books on the Roman Empire and Theodora, everything I could find. And a week later, the library burned down.
Oh my God.
Oh.
So I had them for as long as I wanted. And that's all I'll say about that.
So basically, the mosaic image of Theodora inspired you to research her story and start to write this book about her?
Right. And the professor's nudge there. Yeah. So that's what I did. And that, not knowing how long, decades it would take, because well, the first book, Pushing Out the River, took a very long time. Went through agents and editors and publishers, and finally came out with St. Martin's Press in 2003. And so I had Theodora I was working on. I figured this is going to be book 2. And St. Martin's Press, here it is. Here's book 2. And they didn't look at it. They said, well, we really want something along the lines of Pushing Out the River, set in Poland, 1790s. And that ended up into a trilogy. And I kept going back and working on Theodora. And eventually, Stephen inspired the book. The title of the second book, Too Soon the Night, was the original. It was the second title that became Fortune's Child. My first title for the book was I, Theodora, sort of like I, Claudius. And then it became Too Soon the Night. And then when it became obvious to me that 2 books were needed, Too Soon the Night became the second book's title. So long story short.
And this mosaic, have you ever gone to see it in person?
I haven't, no. I
Is
haven't.
that the one that's in Ravenna?
Ravenna, yes.
Ravenna, yeah, I've seen
Ravenna, yeah.
it. Yeah, it's amazing.
So Faith, when you're doing your research for your books, you've actually gone to some of the sites and done digs and seen some of the artifacts from this time?
Yeah, I was fortunate, actually, to be able to travel. It's something I love to do. And yeah, so I've been to Ravenna, which was the scene of a lot of Twilight Empress, and Rome a couple times. And I did make it to Istanbul, one time Constantinople. And that was in, I think, 2000, I think. Istanbul is it's an amazing place, but it's hard to get there now. I'd like to get back, but I'm not sure that I want to. But yeah, so I've done some archaeological digs as a volunteer. I'm not an archaeologist, but I enjoy doing that. First century villa in Tuscany and on Hadrian's Wall in Great Britain. Tons of fun. Highly recommend it if people want to learn while they're traveling, and it's doing that kind of volunteer work is just fascinating.
One of the things that I loved reading in both of your books, James, one of the things especially was this idea that Theodora came from a bear keeper's daughter. And there was things called the green and blue armies that were mentioned both in your book and in Faith's. James, could you talk to us a little bit about what you mentioned, the green and blue? What exactly were they?
The Greens and the Blues, they were basically political parties. There had been 4: the Reds, the Whites, the Blues, and the Greens, and they just sort of the 2 parties just took over. A lot of them were just kind of young toughs, wearing Gothic hairstyles and just. But they were very much enemies of each other, so that and Theodora and Justinian played it really well for the most part. They Theodora would kind of be partial to the blues and Justinian to the greens, or vice versa. They were always playing one against the other, except for one very critical time when the greens and the blues got together against them. And that was the Nika riots. So Theodora and Justinian almost lost they had a boat ready to sail out, and they almost lost everything.
And speaking of political savvy, Faith, your character, that this young girl became so savvy in terms of advising her younger brother, where do you think she got the chutzpah to do this?
Yeah, that's, I honestly don't know, because we don't have any insight into her personality other than we can look at what she accomplished and think what kind of a person could accomplish this. I mean, we don't have any letters. Well, we have a few religious letters, from her, but nothing that would give us insight. No diaries. There are some contemporaneous historians that write, but that's all fluff and isn't she wonderful? She's great. Or if it's someone else that doesn't like her, isn't she horrible? She's a witch. So I had to make all that up. I had to look at what she accomplished and say, what in her life might have given her the chutzpah to do this? And, we do know some things about her. We knew that both her parents died young. We knew that, she did learn from, probably history. She was well educated. I mean, this was something that the imperial children had. So I surmised that she learned from history, because that's the way I like to learn, so that she, I make it pretty obvious at the beginning that, everybody's trying to protect her, so they don't want to give her a lot of information. And besides, she's a girl, I mean, why would she need to know any of this stuff? So she scratches and scrabbles and reads her histories and talks to people and observes what's going on around her, and works with the man who was Anthemius, who was the regent. And that's what she did. She was a prodigy. She was smart and she learned. And then she practiced some things. So along the way, she learns that, wow, being on the good side of the people is a good way of channeling some power, because the people can riot and the people can do all these things. So she learns that. And then she learns that the church, which quite frankly, at this point in time, was starting to get more and more powerful. The Christian church had been splintered and it's now coming together. So she learns to use the church as one of her levers of power. But her ace in the hole was her relationship with her brother, because he was the real emperor. And she, by law, could not rule. So she had to rule through him. So that I built this character and gave things that happened to her along the way. And, I hope I built a character that other people would believe that, yes, she could do this at 15, because that was a tough haul trying to come up with, the kinds of things that would happen to her that she could learn from, that people would actually believe that a 15-year-old then, took over the empire at 15.
I think certainly that chapter you just read to us about her witnessing the death of her mother was really fantastic, how you set up this spine of steel. And speaking of winning over people's hearts, James, can you talk to us a little bit about Theodora's beginnings as an actress, that she was doing these sort of pantomimes, playing all these sort of famous historical women in these sort of tableaux vivants? Can you talk to us about that?
Okay. In California, down by Laguna, they have these living pictures. And I always think of those when talking about this. So she would appear, this is when she was very young, after she kind of made a name for herself with her sisters, in her sisters' comedies on stage. She would appear in living pictures as, as Aphrodite or anybody out of mythology. and often in very lascivious ways, at least. And if you were to believe Procopius, who wrote about her in the Secret History, he really challenges her character, and just but he gives us three different viewpoints of her in three different works that he did. But
I just found it really fascinating that someone who was in a tableau playing Leda in the Swan became
Right.
one of the most powerful women of the Byzantine emperor. I think she was winning people's hearts because she had empathy, but how she must have been the subject of so much derision, because even today, actresses as rulers, I mean, it's crazy. I mean, it's Meghan Markle. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think of her actually becoming one of the most powerful women on the planet from that beginning.
Yeah, a lot of her contemporaries, didn't forget it, but a lot of them did, and that sort of happened. Like Belisarius, General Belisarius. Well, this is in book 2. He oversees killing 30,000 people in the Hippodrome, and he comes back 2 years later, and he's applauded for having defeated the Vandals in Northern Europe and Northern Africa. So, but with Theodora, she is so much like Eva Peron, it's unbelievable. In fact, I knew this and I recognized this, through my years of working with her. And then I ran across a little self-published book or private published book. The whole book was about comparing her to Eva Peron. And she started out as an actress, prostitute, mistress, the power behind the throne, and both loved by the people and hated by the people. And that just sort of hits all the boxes with Theodora.
And on the other side of this, we have your character, Faith, who was so firmly entrenched in the church. I mean, she did a lot to further the building of churches and the supporting of churches. Do you think that she was also very prejudiced against the Jews, and it was the Goths, the other group that she was adamant against?
Yeah, yes. I mean, this again was a different time, and her views were perfectly Orthodox inside the church. She, this was something that, that she didn't come up with all on her own. This is, they influenced her. She in turn influenced the church. I mean, she actually did put her stamp on the church. Again, lots of things were happening in the Christian church, and it's very complicated. And it all comes down to like the nature of Christ, whether he's a man, whether he's a God, whether he was born a man, become a God, was a God, become a man, there's all sorts of stuff. But lots of people were fighting over this. And in fact, there was some historian wrote about the fact that the fishmonger and the hairdresser would fight over the nature of Christ. This was something that everybody had an opinion on. And for rulers, this is difficult because they don't want a lot of contention going on. They don't want people rioting and fighting over this stuff. So Constantine, in the 300s, tried to get his handle on it, and they came up with the Nicene Code. And this is a theme throughout Pulcheria's life, as just her brother kind of goes back and forth on a couple things. And she finally, towards the end of her life, she has this big, convocation of all these church people. And she says, this is what you're going to do. And she gives them their marching orders, and they come out with everything that she wants in terms of what the church doctrine is going to be. And that was like pretty much the basis for, for the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. And she is considered a saint. She is a saint in both churches because of all her work that she did, not just with the poor, which she did that, but also because she basically said, this is what church doctrine is going to be. Give it to me. all you
Amazing.
bishops.
And James, in your book, Theodora is actually very concerned about church doctrine too, isn't she?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's the same thing. Did Christ have two natures or one nature, or how that all worked? The Monophysites, when she was a governess, and when she was cast off as a governess in North Africa, she came under the tutelage of Monophysites, and just sort of took that as her faith. Whereas she didn't have much of a faith before that, and so the Orthodox, the Chalcedonians, were very much against that, and so that becomes a very similar sort of thing in her life. She becomes very important to the church. She chooses a pope. She has a pope ejected. And this is in book 2. And she puts a pope in power. He doesn't necessarily do what she chose him to do, what he agreed to do, but she's very powerful within the church, and is also a saint in the Eastern Orthodox.
And she very much an influencer to her husband too. Is that correct?
Right. He was more of an Orthodox, a Chalcedonian belief in two natures, but tries to, he had dialogues to just kind of go along with her, had dialogues with the two sides, and after she died, fairly early in her 40s, he continued to try to bring the two sides together, and so she became a saint. This is before Procopius's Secret History came out. Secret History,
thank goodness,
which plays a big part in the two books. I'm not sure she would have become a saint if it had come out, but so much of it in his book is open to question. So
and Faith, I just want to bring up an interesting aspect. You actually have Attila the Hun as part of this whole ravaging, warmongering climate that your character was in. Can you explain a little bit how Attila the Hun is in the storyline here?
Yeah, he plays a big part in both Twilight Empress and Dawn Empress, because the Huns pushed like all the other quote barbarians, to the west as they consolidated their power under many kings and whatever. So that was part of the great barbarian migrations, as they moved. But the Huns had worked with the Eastern court for a couple decades, basically just milking them for money. I mean, it was a, like, hey, nice city you have here. It'd be a shame if something happened to it, and they would, pay up. And they did that, all during Theodosius's reign. But he also, when he got the opportunity, there was a major earthquake that brought the walls of Constantinople down. The walls of Constantinople were considered impregnable. And but the walls came down during this major earthquake, and Attila said, all right, now's my chance. And he jumps, with his horde, and they're heading that way. And this is where the blues and the greens come in my story, because basically they managed to get the blues and the greens to compete against each other to rebuild the walls of Constantinople. And they do it in like 3 months in time to push Attila away. So he comes and says, shoot, the walls are built. Now there's not only just one wall, there's 2 walls and a moat, and all these like 79 towers. And so he decides, I'm going to go, hassle the West for a while, which he does. And then the daughter of my Twilight Empress, her name was Honoria, who was the sister of the emperor, but the daughter of Placidia. was unhappy about what was going on with her life, and because her brother wanted her to marry this boring guy, and she decides, you know what, I don't want to do this. So she sends a ring and some money to Attila and says, can you get me out of this marriage? And Attila says, sure, you're now my fiance. And he sends a note to Theodosius II saying, you know, I want Honoria and half of all the West as her dowry. And he says, ha! And he sends a note to Valentinian, the Eastern. He says, guess what your sister's been up to? And, you know, this, and he says, I recommend you just give her to him, let her, you know, languish in Attila's, you know, harem, because he had many wives, which of course he couldn't do. But anyway, Attila then did invade Western Rome, supposedly to claim his bride and half of the Western Empire as her dowry.
Wow, that's fantastic. And James, you have an earthquake in your book too, isn't that correct?
Yeah, it doesn't play that big of a part. What I want to mention was those towers that Faith mentions, those Theodosian towers. You know, Justinian and Theodora oversaw the first worldwide pandemic. You know, so the plague plays a big part in the second book, not in the first book. But those towers, somebody had when everybody was dying within the city of the plague, they were dying by the thousands a day, and so somebody had the big idea to take the roofs off those towers, because there were no more burial grounds, and drop the bodies into the towers. What? So they filled up the towers with bodies, just not even, you know, making them nice and even, but just kind of dropping them in like chickens into a pot, and then putting the roof back on. Well, when a wind came from the west, it brought a pretty bad stink into the city. So Theodora, she had them dismantle or take the bodies out anyway.
My goodness.
So, but that was the first pandemic that reached Constantinople.
And was that the bubonic plague, James?
Yes, yeah, with the buboes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When Theodora is making her way across the desert, I thought that's just such a wonderful way you described transportation at the time and how you would escape from different places. I don't want to give too much of the plot away, but it's really like an action movie, how she had to become part of this. At that time, was it typical for a woman to be able to move around as freely as Theodora did?
She was protected by the blues. Yeah, otherwise I'm not sure that could have happened, but yeah, her you know, her experience in the theater came back to help her after she was cast off by Hesebodus.
I have to say, after I read that section, I thought, worst tour ever.
It's like under duress and all that sort of stuff, but it's fascinating to read. And I just have another question for you, Faith. When you were researching this character and her adherence to faith, seeing how her background came from supposedly a disreputable mother, did you think that her mother actually was unfaithful, or is this something that was put on to her?
I honestly don't know. I suspect that she was not unfaithful. I suspect she was faithful. I mean, you know, the gossip around the time was that because she had given birth to 3 daughters without, you know, having a son, that when she did give birth to Theodosius, that it couldn't have been her husband. I don't know why, but she had a really bad rep and a beef with the Constantinople bishop. And they were always at each other's throats. And he, was constantly railing against her in his sermons. And he was the one to call her Jezebel of the East and, all kinds of nasty names. And so she had him banished, and he died, off into in the desert somewhere. But I think a lot of it was that she was first of barbarian stock. She was like half Frankish. She was an assertive woman. Her husband was a very weak ruler, and she basically, ran the show. And I'm sorry, but men don't like that. And I think that she got a bad rap from the male historians, particularly the church historians. And I think that she probably, was fine, but it does make for a more interesting story to imply that she might have been, a bit of a rake, but yeah.
Well, we have about 10 minutes left. Stephanie, do we have some questions in the chat field that I don't want to hog all the questions? I could talk forever on this, but are there questions from our audience that they'd like to ask?
We have some. Let me look. Okay, so the first question directly for James is, how did Theodora and Justinian meet? Wasn't she a simple actress prostitute while he was a powerful ruler? There must have been an interesting or apocryphal story behind their meeting. James.
Okay, well, how did they meet in my novel or in real life? In real life, we don't quite know exactly how they met, but she had already had this big history behind her of having been a mistress that was cast off, of having had one, possibly two children, and she came back and she changed her life when she got back to Constantinople. There's pretty much agreement on that. She became a weaver and gave up the boards, the theater and prostitution, and somewhere along the line met him. In Fortune's Child, Stephen already knows her. Stephen's working at the palace, so there's a connection there. Stephen is kind of responsible for bringing the two together.
Okay, so the second question just says author's question, and since there's no question so far directly to Faith, let's give this to her, and let us say that for the first question for James, Joyce Hanson made that question. So Joyce Hanson is going to get a free ebook. And for the first question to Faith, what complications, this is actually to both of you, but I'll put it to Faith. What complications did you both have to overcome writing in modern English about a Latin language time?
Yeah. That's a very interesting question, because this is something that historical fiction writers have to deal with all the time. We don't know what ancient Latin sounded like, or Greek. Most of the people spoke Greek where I was at. At the time they lived, the people thought, this is modern times. There is no future. This is the modern times. So I tended to write with a more modern sound to it, but maybe with more class differences, rather than, because, the people speak differently than they write formally. We do have formal documents, but they're church documents. They're, they're histories. So I tended to write with a more modern cast. I, try to steer away from things like, I wouldn't use modern metaphors. I would say, God's blood or something like that. That wouldn't work. That's an English thing, and it comes much later. But but yeah, I tried to do it because I just feel like it was modern times for them.
So that was asked by Jerry. So Jerry receives an e-copy of your book, Faith, but since it's directed to both of you authors, James, can you answer that? What complications did you both have to overcome writing in modern English about a Latin language time?
Well, plus she spoke Greek, and Latin was the language of the church and the palace. But Faith gave an excellent answer, and I just agree with everything on that. Just to keep our readers, we need to keep it a little bit modern. But
Yeah.
And I'm always on the lookout for things that are statements or similes, metaphors that are just too current, because people will jump all over that. But that was a great answer.
Here's a question for you, James and Faith. James, could you tell us, what would you think is Theodora's main flaw? If she were to have a basic failing, what would you think that would be?
Why don't you go to Faith? What do you think?
All right, Faith, what would you think that your character's basic flaw would be?
Yeah. I'm going to answer this kind of like they do with, in a job interview, what's your main flaw? I work too hard. Her main flaw was she was very ambitious, and
Art class.
Sorry. Yeah. So she was very ambitious. And what I try to do is show that ambition comes from love and fear and uncertainty that happens in her life, that her ambition was all about control so that she could keep her brothers safe and her country safe and her church safe. But she was a very ambitious woman and comes across in the history as quite power hungry. So, I had to come up with why, in a way that would make her seem sympathetic to people.
And James, what do you think? Do you think that people have painted Theodora as being aggressively ambitious, or is this just a historical rewrite?
Oh, she was definitely ambitious, and so I was thinking about that question. She had kind of tunnel vision as far as empathy. She could empathize when she chose to, or when it moved her, but she could be cruel and send people off to islands or to the dungeon or to death. But women's rights, she made history with women's rights. There's just a whole list of things that she had Justinian put in the Justinian's code.
Wasn't she the first ruler to say that women had the right to own property?
To own property, to get their dowry back if the husband died, to outlaw honor killings. Yeah, she freed up these young girls that were brought in from the country as prostitutes, freed them, and gave them some money or a place to stay, and so she was very much about women's rights.
And I asked Faith this, but I didn't get a chance to ask you, can you tell us why you chose Fortune's Child as your title?
It just seemed to be a theme that came up naturally in the book about Tyche, the goddess of fortune. And originally, like I said, it was I, Theodora, and then it became Too Soon the Night. And when I knew it was going to be two books, I just needed to go somewhere else, because Too Soon the Night, makes sense for the second last book, but didn't make sense for the first. So
We have a question here from Roger for you, James. He says you use the Dutch words swab and the American slang word swabby. Did you struggle with those usages?
okay, that I use both of them. Is that
Yeah,
what?
that's what Roger was asking.
Okay. I remember swab in the book. Did I use swabby in the book, or just did I say it here? I'm not sure. And I don't recall any struggle.
Okay. Okay, we just have like 3 minutes left. Do we have any other questions, Stephanie?
I would like to ask a question, if I might. Do either of you have any opposition from publishers working in this period? Or is it acceptable as, say, the 19th century or the, I don't know, World War II or whatever? Did you have any opposition to selling your books in this period?
Well, my answer is easy because I self-publish.
Ah.
But I did have a lot of opposition when I tried to sell my first book. I had agents and it was out to lots of different places. And basically, what I was getting was, love the characters. It's a great story, fun writing, blah, blah, blah. Do you have anything about the Tudors? This was, I think, this was the big Tudor rage. And so I struggled with that for 5 years while I was writing my other books. And I finally said, look, I'm going to give it a try and see if I can find an audience. And so I did, and I found an audience, and I found that there are people who like to read about the 5th century as well as the Tudors. So yeah, I gave up on the publishers because they really were very narrow.
And now it's World War II.
Yeah, now it's World War II, exactly.
Up your yin yang, the World War II.
Mm.
Yes, I was very close to signing with the Amazon historical fiction. I'm blanking out on the name of the
Lake Union.
Yeah,
Lake Union.
Yeah.
She almost took me at Lake Union. Came an inch close, met with her, just loved the book, loved all of my books. And then in the end, she said, we're not having a good time with the period.
Mm-hmm.
And they just stopped buying any books from that period.
Mm-hmm.
So people like Faith and I and others, we need to just keep plugging away. Our time will come, I think, for this period.
Yeah, I think you have to do what's sent to you, what's in your heart, which comes from you. I think that's what you have to do. And if you love this period so much, you must write in this period. You find the prejudice extends to the whole, say, classical world, the whole Roman Empire. I mean, Mary Renault made a huge career writing about the Greeks. And some people break through, but does it extend, the prejudice extend to the whole period, you think?
I do, yeah. Right now I do, yeah.
But it shows you the time, really, because people have made, Claudius, people have made huge breakthroughs, and publishers can be a little narrow in their thoughts. Thank you very much. I wanted to know that. I don't think we have any more questions. Does anybody want to ask another question?
And if we could have Jerry direct message me his email address. We have Joyce's email to send her book, but we need your email so that we can make sure that you got your email. Oh my goodness, thunder is killing us.
This has been foretold.
Is that New York thunder?
Yes, it's rolling in.
Yeah.
I will add one brief little note. When you were talking, James, about Theodora being the one who introduced women's rights, she was certainly the first within the Roman legal context, but women could have own property in Mesopotamia, certainly in the Hittite context. So they're much earlier cultures. We think of history as this sort of progressive thing, but it's highly cyclical. The Romans were very terrible on the subject of women. The Greeks were even worse, but there were other ancient cultures that
Egypt as well. Egypt.
Egypt.
Yeah. Egypt was great. Yeah.
Hittite queens carried on after their kings died. I mean, so there are other cultures, but you're absolutely right in the Roman context.
Egyptian women could divorce, for whatever reason they wanted and get their dowries back. So yeah.
Well, it looks like we've got our questions, and Thunder is telling us to go close our windows. We got our emails for our ebooks, but I want to thank both James and Faith for being part of this panel. Your books about empresses are just fascinating. And I think as we're having more women leaders come up in the world, it's going to be so fascinating to look back and see what these books, how important they are in terms of not only understanding history, but having a good perspective on it.
And that concludes our program. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. You can find out more about the New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society and our leadership at our website, or contact us at hns-nyc@mail.com. And finally, please consider supporting our volunteer panelists and hosts. You can contact them at their websites below. Thanks for joining us.